Blind Advocate. You want the truth? You can't handle the truth. The Blind Advocate will get you there.
Yep. Good morning and welcome to another live this morning. First things first, I still need everyone's help with YouTube. I need more subscribers. I need 1,000 subscribers. That way I can get some money from YouTube to help run this channel. It's getting a bit expensive, as everyone knows, with the cost of living. A couple of weeks ago, I went onto an email service run by Adam Morris. It's primarily for people who are blind or vision impaired. And he sent an article out about Salesforce. And, you know, some of it already knew. Some of it I didn't know. Things have been changing. Then a few days ago on the news, there was a thing that a consultancy firm was paid $440,000 by the federal government for a report on I think it was Centrelink. And the report was actually done through using AI, and there was that many mistakes and errors in it, and some of the facts that they said were in there were actually wrong. Like there was a ruling by a federal court which was completely untrue. And then the other day when I was looking around, I come up across this little story about Salesforce. Let's just play that, Chris.
A major cyber attack has rocked Australia's flag carrier, Qantas Airways.
Hackers have reportedly released 5.7 million customers' data on the dark web, and the airline confirmed that the data stolen during a July cyber incident, and this is according to Qantas Airlines. The breach originated from a third-party platform, cloud company Salesforce. That is how it exposed information such as names, email IDs, frequent flyer details, and in some cases even birth dates, addresses, and phone numbers.
Earlier, the hackers had stolen nearly 1 billion records from about 40 global firms, including Toyota, Disney, and IKEA, and thereafter hackers demanded ransom. The report suggests the group tricked company IT desks by posing as employees to gain access.
Qantas says no credit card, passport, or login data was compromised, and the airline has obtained a court order to stop further data sharing. Qantas says it's working with Australia's Cybersecurity Centre and Federal Police. Affected customers have been offered identity protection and 24/7 support. Qantas says that it has tightened monitoring and staff training since the breach.
Okay, so again, at Salesforce has come up again in that article. Sorry, technical glitch there. So, along with my support worker, whom I'm going to introduce shortly, we decided to have a bit of a deep dive into Salesforce. There was an article that came out through the Australian where apparently some senior management of the NDIA and board members during the tender process were given some, I don't know what would call, I believe is called kickbacks, amounting, for hospitality, restaurants and booze and, whatever. That was referred off to the appropriate departments by the NDIA. And nothing's been said about it since. My support worker and I decided to go and dissect and do a deep dive into Salesforce. Now, I'm going to introduce my support worker, Chris. Welcome.
Hi, how you going?
Good. Now, can you just let everyone know what your experience is with the federal government?
Okay, so I used to work for the federal government. Part of my role was in dealing with the tender process with information platforms, putting information platforms in place, working out contracts, needs analysis, identifying, sort of connecting, I guess, the government agencies with the companies that are actually doing the tender work for the government. So making sure that the agency that I was working for was getting something that was value for money and something that was suitable for its needs. And so I did that for quite a number of years. And yeah, it was sort of quite enlightening looking at the issues that were raised with Salesforce, because I know that we had very strict rules on not receiving gifts and not being influenced on decisions that were being made, and we adhered to those very strictly. So it was a bit of a surprise, really, to find out that Salesforce had been taken off on golfing. That the Salesforce people had taken the government employees of the NDIA off onto golfing days, I think was one of the things that was mentioned, as well as sort of wined and dined and taken off to events and all sorts of other things. So they weren't completely explicit in exactly everything that they'd received, but I think the rule is that anything over $100 should be declared, and you're not supposed to be receiving large gifts anyway, especially when there's a big tender process on the offing. And they were criticised. I think it was Senate estimates that criticised them, as well as some of the other agencies that some of the regulators that inquired into it. That they said that they shouldn't have been engaging in that at all, and it meant that some of the other companies that might have gotten the tender otherwise then didn't, and this carried through not only with that, but some suspicions about the winning of the tender itself, because was it $27 million was the original estimate, wasn't it, Jeff?
It was, but that's not uncommon for private companies to wine and dine potential clients, customers.
It's not, but not within the government sphere. Within the
No.
government sphere, there's because they want to reduce corruption and remove any conflict of interest. If you're a private law firm, that's completely fine. You can take people out to dinner to try and influence the decision to purchase anything as much as you want. But within the government sector, because they set themselves to a higher standard, and you've got to meet the Australian Public Service Code of Conduct when you're doing any work for the federal government, and part of that is adhering to their rules about not having a conflict of interest, and they clearly, the reports found that they hadn't done that. So they've been investigated. They said that in some cases this was forwarded on to the federal police, I believe, but there was no word on what actually was the outcome of that, or what tier of staff were being involved. Was that purely the team in charge of the tenders? Was that up to an SES level, or was that sort of CEOs of the organisation? It doesn't really say.
No, it doesn't. And they sort of, when we looked into that over the last couple of days, they very expertly kept that information, those names, quiet. They don't publish them. They don't let the public know the names of the people who have actually breached those codes of conduct and policies about accepting kickbacks or bribes. So yeah, that's a freedom of information that I'm going to put forward through to the NDIA, and to find out what those outcomes were, because those people who were reported. We need to know these things. The government's got to be transparent in absolutely everything it does, and we all know the State and Federal Public State, they cover their backside. It's the first thing they do. Don't they? They just cover their backside all the time. They don't worry about what the public perception is. It's just covering their backside.
Yes, well, there are rules around protecting Australian public servants from being in the political eye or in the public eye, but there are also political appointments within government agencies. So there are protections that are put in place. I have heard before criticisms about the fact that certain groups of people are excluded from, say, freedom of information requests. Ministers outside of their capacity managing a department, is my understanding, are exempt from freedom of information requests. And I've heard people criticise that before as well, given that the ministers are the ones that pass the laws. But what people are doing in the act of their performing their job, that there should be some level of accountability, and I think this is something that's very important within the federal government, that people should be accountable for decisions that they're making. Particularly if they're breaching the rules, but also if they've made very, very poor decisions, they shouldn't then just keep on going up the line and keep on getting promoted and becoming more and more senior. If someone makes a very bad decision, I think that in the federal government that they should have some repercussions from that. So I think that the federal government's an interesting beast, because I know that when they are they're trying to downsize the federal government, they offer redundancies. And so you often have a case where people who are very employable or people who have good skills will take those redundancies, and then they can go on, they can find employment in the private sector. And sometimes they can get a job in the private sector and end up getting contracted back into the federal government, which there was a report recently that said that when there were the last big lot of cuts from the federal government, that this is exactly what happened, is that the overall cost of staffing actually increased because the federal government ended up re-employing people who'd been fired at a contract level from the private sector, which is just sort of, yeah, sometimes working in the federal government, you feel like it's a bit like an episode of Yes Minister. It's a bit crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing, like, with the tender process, the ministers make all the decisions, and the ministers' lawyers and all that they go through. And once these tenders go through, it's quite possible that some of those people can jump ship from the federal government and go and work for the company that they've just got the tender from.
Yes, well, I think that was with the classic example. That was the Cross City Tunnel, wasn't it? That I think Bob Carr was directly involved in the negotiations with Macquarie Bank, who are the major financiers for the Cross City Tunnel.
Yeah, and
then it was his last hurrah before he supposedly retired to the private sector. And then the first thing that he did was got a massive consultancy for sitting on some board with the Macquarie Bank.
Yes,
and the contract was criticised as being very much in Macquarie Bank's favour. So that was state government, but along all tiers of government, they should be holding themselves to the same high standard, and it shouldn't matter whether you're a minister.
Well, they should be held to a high standard, because they're the ones making the decisions. They're the ones collecting, huge pay packets, making these decisions for the average taxpayer.
Yes.
And if they're doing this and there's a conflict of interest, well, it should be upfront and transparent and honest, and it's not. And this is the trust that the average person doesn't have and most politicians, because they all know they're there to defend their own nest. Anyway, so when we had a look at Salesforce, when we looked into the costings of it, now in 2022, it was estimated to be about $27 million for the Salesforce software program. Now that's ballooned out to 2024 to 135 million.
Yeah, I think there have been suggestions that it's as high as 185, but I think that the NDIA has confirmed that it's 135 to 140, I think, something like that.
Yeah, and then in the next few years, it's estimated to cost $210 million. So how in the hell do we go from 27 million to 135, and then in a few years' time to 210 million?
Yeah.
How does that happen through?
Well, part of the way the contract was negotiated was that it's on the payment is on a user license basis.
So when you say user license, you mean we're talking about the Salesforce and the NDIS. So is that user license per participant?
So it's not per participant. So the customers are the participants are seen as customers on the site. So it's not per them, but it's my understanding, and this is most systems, they might have negotiated something differently, but generally what it is per person accessing the back end. So it's a bit like if you were managing, say, the system for Coles, then you're not being charged per customer that's buying groceries through the Coles website. What they're doing is that they're charging for, say, staff in a Coles outlet that need to be able to access the system to make modifications. You have the managers have then a different tier of access, so they can go in and adjust the way things are laid out and more broadly control higher level functions within it. You'd have IT staff that can then manage it to a very high level, that are adjusting permissions, who has access, security on the site, and content the way that it's laid out on the site. And then you'd also have Salesforce administrators who would then be applying things like security patches to the site to try and make sure that it's up to the most recent security standards and things like that. So there's all of those users have an access license. And so what happens in that situation is that as you have more participants in the NDIA, you proportionally have more managers. You've got plan managers, support coordinators, more LAC staff, more staff to handle inquiries at the NDIA, and all of those people would have access. And the way that they negotiate it is, rather than it being a flat cost, is that as the NDIA gets larger, then proportionally the cost gets larger. Now, that's not necessarily the best way to do it, because if you think about it, in essence, the platform that they're putting in place isn't massively different depending on how many customers there are, depending on how many licenses there are. The system is essentially the same. You have to run the same security patches on it. You have to just maintain the same level of security. It doesn't matter. It's just more data. It's more data on a server. So it was raised in Senate estimates as well as to why they opted for a contract where, as the system got larger, then the people who were implementing it, Salesforce, were getting paid more money.
That's I mean, that's just amazing that the government would agree to that. I mean, to have all those people on a license to access the Salesforce software, and it cost from $27 million, which is a lot of money, to 135 to 140 million a year. Then in a few years' time, it's going to be at least $210 million a year. Why didn't the government see this as being? Why do you think the government didn't see this as being an issue? But the ongoing costs and blowout that every media and journalist and politician criticises the NDIA about is the cost blowout. It's just adding more to it.
Yeah, look, I don't know if I know that the costs are going to be very high. I don't know if that's always per year or once it's up and running. You have to look at the actual terms of the contract as to what the ongoing costs per year are going to be. But certainly, if it is on a license basis, and that is the case, that it's going to be anywhere near that sum of money, then that makes it a significant expenditure. I think maybe they're looking at it because it is a large organization. They're looking at it as being that on a per participant basis, it's not that high once you divide it amongst all those people, but it's still, when you look at it, you think a couple of $100 million is still a couple of $100 million. It's still a very large sum of money, and that could fund a lot of people's supports, really. And when they're in an environment of trying to reduce fraud, and there's been a lot of talk online as well about how, even though they said they weren't going to reduce the funding to participants, there's a lot of evidence that this is actually what's happening, is that people's plans are getting savagely cut. That then maybe by improving their internal processes, they could also be saving money rather than just looking externally, looking at how they can work more efficiently and not, and getting the best value for money for what they're spending.
Well, according to the NDIA and some of the larger journalists, not the Australian newspaper and that, the ongoing cost increase and people coming into the NDIS is increasing by 10% a year. So, those, if that's the case, then those licensing agreements are then going to cost another 10% to run because there's more people using it. The license agreement.
Yeah, well, we'd have to look into it more closely to see exactly what they're going to have as their agreement ongoing. But a lot of the time, if you signed a 4-year agreement, then it is whatever's been locked into the contract. So you don't have a lot of latitude to be able to come back afterwards. And it's also a lot of these systems as well are proprietary. So I know something that was quite important when we were putting our systems in place meant that if we wanted to opt for a different system, is how transferable would that be? They don't make their own systems from scratch. They have these big sort of monolithic systems that are that have the ability to do transactions and different levels of managers and things. And then a company like Salesforce will come in and they will modify it for each customer they have, whether it's Qantas or whether it's the NDIA or whether it's someone else. So yes, I think that if they're going to be if they're locked into the system and it is proprietary, then if they turn around and they say, oh, well, we do want to change these terms and conditions, we want to have it so we're not on a user license basis, we want to have more control over that, where we can set up as many licenses as we want without additional cost to the company, then how transferable is that? They might find that it's all encrypted. That might be part of the security measures as well, but they might find that it's incredibly expensive to then migrate to a new system.
So, I mean, the federal government's locked us into this contract with Salesforce, and the way it's costing us, increasing every year, they've literally got us over a barrel, and like you're just saying, even if the federal government says, oh, we don't want this contract anymore, we're not going to renew it, then all that software and the information that's in that Salesforce program has to be transferred to another program. At what cost? How much is that going to cost? Is it transferable, and how much will it cost? That's another thing that we need to find out.
Well, it is an interesting question. If they seem to have massively underquoted on the job, and the criticism that was, again, this was from the Australian parliamentary website, and the results of the inquiries into the engagement with Salesforce, is that the reason that it's massively increased is because the NDIA did a fairly poor job on the needs analysis. There were things that one of the reasons that the cost of the setup of the site in the first place was massively increased was because they didn't have, I think it was transactional functions within the site. So if you're sort of going, well, you don't know what transactions are going to occur within the website, that's kind of crazy. I don't know if that was just simply like an e-commerce system where you could pay bills and reimburse money through the website, but surely they should have known that beforehand. I mean, surely that should have all been scoped out in the contract. And I don't know the details of it. I don't think that they, through the estimates inquiries, they don't release all of the information that they have in front of them. But certainly the people on the inquiry found that there were massive holes in their system. So then you do think if they didn't manage to get that right, then are they likely to put in place what they call it's making sure that there's legacy processes put in place, which means that it's taking into account what happens when that system gets taken away. I mean, every agency is supposed to have legacy documents where they basically say what happens if the government decides not to fund this agency anymore. What happens to all of that information? What happens if someone else comes in and takes over the entire thing? What happens if it gets overhauled? Because government changes quite a lot. Now, you do have to ask the question, is that if they're going to take this site down, does that mean that you're going to have then this massive migration issue as well? There's just a lot of questions there that should be answered and should be addressed. But it looks like the the project's gone through its initial prototyping stage down in Tasmania, and they're just going to be forging ahead with it. However it is, I just hope that the people in charge of the project are going to be setting it up properly, because I mean, something like this, if you have even minor issues with the usability of the site, then that can have massive ripples. With you've got 700,000 participants, which I think is representing. I think there's millions of staff when you add up all the plan managers and the sport coordinators and all of the other people who are going to engage with the system. And I mean, even participants engage on a fairly basic level. You want to make sure your accessibility is absolutely watertight. You want to make sure that all of the interactions are totally watertight, and you want to make sure that it's not it's fairly resistant to the type of fraud that the NDIA has been fighting against recently. So they're not wasting money trying to combat that as well.
So when you and I looked into Salesforce last year, we did that live about the alleged kickbacks. We looked online. We found this article that it did say Salesforce, but we found this to be incorrect the last week or so, in the last few days, that apparently Salesforce was used by the UK Post Office. And there were glitches in the system, and some reports say over 700, other reports say over 900 business managers, like the privatised post office, were charged with fraud, jailed. Some people lost their businesses, lost their houses, lost their families, got divorced, and there are at least 13 suicides. Now, when we started looking at this again, it came out and it was not Salesforce that the UK Post Office aligned themselves with. It was Horizon IT, run by a software program that was run by the Fujitsu company in Japan. Now, the Post Office in the UK knew about the glitches in this program from 1999 to 2015, and they knew that the glitches were causing all these misalignments with the accounting, but they still went ahead and prosecuted over 700 or 900 people and sent them to jail. Yeah, how can we ensure that this doesn't happen with this system that the NDIA is going to be using?
And you're right, it wasn't Salesforce in the UK, but it is a good example of what happens when you have a large information platform that isn't managed properly and isn't regulated and doesn't have people doing sanity checks, making sure that it is actually running properly. I mean, Robodebt is another classic example of what happens when you have these massive systems. They go, "Oh, we'll just get the computers to do it, and everything will be fine." This is the danger as well with having AI being so ubiquitous now, that everyone's going, "Oh, we'll get AI to help streamline the process, and it'll be 98% correct." But I mean, even if it was 98% correct, those you need to make sure those 2% of times that it's not causing massive problems. Because with something like the NDIA, you're dealing with a lot of vulnerable people. You're dealing with people who often struggle to represent themselves. So if something does go wrong, they won't necessarily pick it up. The NDIA has a responsibility in that situation to make sure that they are looking after these people, and the systems that they put in place to achieve greater efficiencies and losing less money through fraud or through mismanagement doesn't inadvertently mean that there are people falling between the cracks. Because in this situation, that's just not okay.
Yeah, I mean, what happens, this is what I'm really concerned about, is when this gets too expensive with Salesforce and the government decides to ditch Salesforce and go with another company. And we just touched on it a few minutes ago about transferring all that information to a new software system. That initial cost of transferring all that information, if it is possible, it may not be possible to transfer it to another software program.
Yeah, there are ways you can do. What you essentially end up doing is crawling through, getting a program to basically literally open up every page and literally pull the information and the data out of every page. There's massive potential there. If that's what they have to end up doing, there's potential there for errors all over the place, and it could be a big process. I mean, I don't know if maybe the way they have set it up is so it is migratable. I mean, maybe the Salesforce itself, although it did have a data breach, has a reasonable reputation for being a robust system. I've never worked with it myself, so I don't know. But it's the problem is that it's not. They might have the skills and the capacity to be able to make it so it is migratable, but it's not really in their interest to do so, is it? Because if they don't want to make it so their system is easily transferable into something new. And I think that I think it was the ATO might have been in relation to ASIC as well, had a massive financial system that was they were looking at trying to migrate that over to a new one. I think it was based on Lotus Notes or something. It was like some system that was about 15 years old or 16 years old. These systems tend to have a rotation of like 5 to 10 years. 10 years is an old system. So they had something that had been going for so long, but the reason it had gone on for so long, and they had been recommended for security reasons, if nothing else, you should be upgrading fairly continually. Basically, by the time you finish one project, you should be starting on the next one. Like painting the Harbour Bridge. Is that you should be making it so that it is transferable. And they had this behemoth of a system with widgets built on widgets built on widgets, and they just found that the process of trying to unravel it was just completely untenable. It was very, very difficult. So I think that they've. I don't know. I haven't seen any news on that more recently, but I think that they have sort of updated their system. But something like this, you need to take that into account. You need to look at it and say, okay, Salesforce is around now. Who's to say that Salesforce as a company is still going to be around in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? And there's all sorts of things that can happen. They could end up being bought out by someone else that then decides that they don't find that system tenable anymore, and that they end up retiring it. You need to know in advance. I don't know if they built these things into it or not, but it should be definitely taken into consideration.
Because we know when we've been looking in the last few days that the NDIAs, the NDIS, it's a highly customized Salesforce to meet its needs, especially the PACE system. Are those customized bits of the system? So are they going to be able to be transferred, or are they just part of the Salesforce algorithm?
And this is a very good point, Jeff, because the more you customize it, the harder it is. I know with our system, the more widgets you built into it, you then want to run a security patch through it, and the whole thing falls over because of all these customizations that we make to it. It's still considered the best practice to have these big systems, and then you can make modifications to it. But when you look at, there's other agencies that I worked with, like did some work with the Attorney General's Department, and they had a fantastic IT team. They had this huge team of people, highly qualified, highly experienced. They have their own team of security experts. When we're passing things on to them, they could take it and they could do all the modifications in-house. They could make it so that it was legacy compliant. They could make sure that it was best practice. They could make sure that there was that things are always going to be prone to security breaches on some level, but they can make sure as soon as something happens, they have a team of people who can jump on it, crack down on it, work out where it's coming from, work out what's happening, and close that loophole straight away. The way the federal government works is that rather than having the whole of government using a singular system. The way that it works is that every government agency has, in the name of having an open market and engaging with an open market, is that every government agency can have a completely different system. I can see why they want to allow the private sector to come in and do this work and engage with government on this level, but I don't know if it's always the best way to go. And the tender process is massive, it's lengthy, it's complicated, and you're relying on what the agencies are telling you, and that they're salespeople. They're not always going to accurately describe exactly how their system works or what the limitations are of their system.
But salesmen do, they tell you what you want to hear to make that sale, don't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And they'll, you can, language is such a fluid thing. You can use weasel words to sort of say that, oh yes, more broadly, our site is fantastic at transactions, but then, when you go to put in an e-commerce system, you say, oh, well, we didn't mean financial transactions, we meant transactions in the broader sense. There's always ways that you can get around things when you're a salesperson. So this is why it's very important, I think, that it's good if the government can have as many people with specific experience as possible. And I think that there are, and I know when I was working in government, there were some people who were absolutely brilliant at what they did, really leaders in their field, and it was very different to what I think a lot of people see the federal government as being a bunch of sort of automatons that are all following each other. There are some real leaders and some fantastic people in there, but there are equally some people in there who are just sort of public servants who've been possibly promoted above their level, who are then, end up being put in charge of projects where they don't have enough expertise to understand what they don't know. And this is a problem. If you don't know how much you don't know to ask questions.
Yeah, exactly. Or what questions to ask. Yeah.
Wasn't it? I think it was Donald Rumsfeld that said, you have known knowns and known unknowns. And he had, at the time, he was criticised as being a bit of a rambling fool. But I think he was talking about how with any project you have your known unknowns, which are the things that you need to find out. But you have your unknown unknowns, which are the things that you can't possibly anticipate. And so you need to have people who are cunning and intelligent and lateral thinkers, so that they can nut down on those, get those unknown unknowns to sort of, pull them apart and try and, dig out what the problems are before they become systemic problems, and try and resolve them as you go. So yeah, hopefully they're aware of this. But
so when you work for the federal government, because I know in the past that, according to the legislation, Australian data is supposed to be kept in Australia. Is that still the case? Do you know?
Oh, it was. Look, the advice that we'd received was sort of yes and no. It's wrong to look at the Australian government as a single entity. That it's made up of different departments who often have quite overlapping roles. And I think the advice that we've been given from some was that Australian data should be kept in Australia so that we can maintain the integrity of that data. And certainly, if you've got anything that's confidential, personal private information, if it's being stored in Australia, then you have more control over that. But at the same time, when you have cloud systems, and a cloud system is just where you have a whole bunch of servers, and they can be modern cloud systems like Amazon. They have servers all over the world. So if you engage Amazon Cloud Services, then your website, a little bit of it could be in America, a little bit could be in Canada, some of it could be in India, some of it could be in Ukraine. You wouldn't know. And it's just sort of, they share data around from server to server based on needs and based on location. So when you're using those, you can't maintain it. And I think that
Mm.
what we were then told by other people is that that's okay because that's just the way that technology is at the moment. So I don't know how to answer that. To be honest, I don't know. At the end of it, I think we all sort of looked at and went, "Oh, this is very complicated." But there are certainly agencies that are storing digital assets, on cloud systems. It's the way it works. It's
Because one thing, with the digital age that I have a problem with, like, before I went on the NDIS, only me personally, and my doctor knew 100% of everything.
Mm.
Now that I'm on the NDIS, anyone could access my personal private information.
Yeah.
It's so wrong. I don't think if you don't want to give out personal information, part of your disability, that's your right. You don't have to do it. But the government says if you want the funding, then this is what you got to do. Again, with that data information, I really worry about people hacking into Salesforce and then blackmailing Salesforce or the federal government to pay a ransom for to keep the information, the data.
Yeah. Well, because it's only as safe as its weakest link. And the problem is you have people who just don't know they don't know what they should be doing. It's not that they're not necessarily malicious. So I think the example of that was the Australian government on the Universal Medical Database. I can't remember what it was called. And I read that they had, and this was supposed to be. I mean, this is the Australian government database, which is storing all your medical information, so that if I happen to be on holidays in Cairns and I passed out and they took me to hospital, they could have a look on the system and go, "Oh, he's got whatever, and maybe needs this medication or that medication." So there's a good reason to have that system. But the agency sold, as a cost recouping exercise, sold some of that information to insurance companies. And you're just like, on what planet does a federal government employee turn around and go, like, they didn't personally profit from it. They actually did it as an agency. They turn around and go, "Oh, we should sell personal information to a private company." And you've just relinquished all that information. And once that's gone, it's gone. There's no coming back. And this was a disturbing thing in that Qantas article that you just saw recently, is that they said, "Oh, well, there were no passport information that went out there as far as they know." And how do they necessarily know the results of all those breaches? That there was no additional information that was taken out. But when you take bits of information and then you can sell them on the dark web, people can go through and they can collate that information back together again, and that's when you have identity theft and fraud, and you have people who set up a personal loan or a home loan in someone's name because they've managed to collect enough information to convince someone through an online application that they are the same person. You set it up so it's protected by Face ID, but then you have you could have someone download your pictures off Facebook and use your face off that to try and get through the Face ID authentication. You can have people hack your mobile phone, so you've got two-factor identification through SMS, and then someone's hacked your phone line, so they're intercepting those SMSs as they come through. It works on a number of levels. Nothing is completely safe.
Well, look at the data breach last year in the NDIA. There was an NDIA employee who sold information to a couple of service providers in Sydney. Now, as far as I know, that the NDIA staff person that did that was actually charged. But again, we've heard nothing about it. This is where the transparency, the honesty, the integrity of look at the one we did a couple of weeks ago with that girl or young woman who got on the NDIS and wrote her own doctor's report and all that stuff, and then the CEO of the NDIA at the time, Rebecca Fortingham, because it was on 2GB, then emailed her top minions and said, "Get her off the system now." there was no due process. So, with that data breach, and then the CEO of the NDIA, Rebecca Fortneham, kicking that person off without due process, how, as we as participants, supposed to stand up against, people doing the wrong things from the NDIA board to the NDIA senior management to the federal minister's office working with the tenders with Salesforce and participants of the NDIA? We're the ones that have been kicked in the gut, saying that you're abusing your funding or you're defrauding the. We're not. 99% of the participants are doing the right thing. It's just that the 1% who aren't, or 2% who aren't doing the wrong thing, doing the right thing. Yeah, we've got to stop this bashing.
Well, it means that people get fearful. To be honest, I've been on the other side of the fence. I had my wife was before she passed away was on the NDIS, and it was really scary. We had times where at one stage, because of a glitch where we had the NDIA cancelled our funding because of something that had happened. Simultaneously, Centrelink, because of another glitch, thought that we were earning $250,000 a year, and so cut all of the pension benefits and carers pension. And we had to go back and prove to them that it wasn't the case. It's very hard to prove something like that because, especially when I went to Centrelink and said, well, they said, you earn it this much money. And I said, well, where are you getting that from? And so, well, we're not going to tell you that. It's up to you to prove that it's not the case. How do you prove that you haven't earned $200,000? We went to the ATO and we said, well, what do you have on record? And they said, well, we had on record that you weren't basically nothing because I was full-time carer at the time. And you go back to Centrelink and you go, but the ATO says that. So, well, that's not what our records say. And you kind of go, without having access to the system, without being able to see behind the curtain. And I think this is something it's good for people who work in these organizations to have lived experience so they know what it's like being on both sides of the fence, that then they understand how fearful you can be when an agency can turn around and with the click of a button, then everything gets cut off. And when these sorts of things happen, where the agency's been accused of not following the correct processes, or what happened with Rebecca Fortneham not going through the usual processes for taking someone off the NDIS, then it means that people who, and a lot of people with disability, are used to being treated as second-class citizens. They're used to just being stomped on, and that takes even more of that faith in the system away from them. So they are less likely to make complaints. They're less, if they're in a workplace situation where they're being discriminated against, they're less likely to make a complaint because they are used to being marginalised. That's normalised behaviour. And then when it happens on an agency level, they think, oh, well, I'm not going to complain about it because then they might cut my funding even further. Or something else might happen down the track. They're going to get me back for it. And I found sometimes the conversations we had with staff of the NDIA, they were saying, oh, at one stage I think they cut AT funding but increased one-on-one funding to recognise that her condition was declining. And we said, well, how are we going to have less AT funding? Like, we can't get rid of any of the equipment that we have. And you can't have a person come in and replace a bed or a hoist or a commode chair or something. It was just this insane situation. And the person on the phone got really quite haughty about it and said, well, you should be grateful because we've gone in and we've looked at your situation. They actually said we should be grateful because they had increased the number of face-to-face hours because her situation was declining, even though they had just taken it away from, they hadn't given us any more money. They just taken it away from assistive technology. Now I managed to get that back. We actually spoke to our local member, and he turned around, and within 24 hours, once they got onto it, within 24 hours, we had someone from the NDIA calling us up and saying, "Oh, look, that should never have happened. We're really, really sorry." But what was the stats recently on complaints to the complaints that were being upheld about the NDIA? There was like 80% of complaints were being substantiated in the tribunal.
I think around 85, I think.
85, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. So in those cases, 85 of those people who have the tenacity to be able to push it through, to actually go to the tribunal, put together the case, the amount of stress that's involved, especially if you're a person with a disability, in trying to put those things together, the anxiety that you have, that you're worried that by putting in this complaint that it's going to affect you in the long term, and then that they find that many cases that it's where the NDIA has done the wrong thing, is extraordinary. I think it's just, I think it's good if people understand the psychology behind it. If they understand that people who are participants of the NDIS are that they're behind the 8 ball to start with, no matter what their capacity is. Even if, I had both myself and my wife were relatively senior members of the federal government. We knew the language the government uses. We knew, she's a lawyer. She knew how to get what she wanted out of the federal government if possible, and we struggled. We really struggled just to get the basic needs met. And we constantly looked at it and said, what if there's someone out there who doesn't have family support and has a cognitive impairment and can't fight the system and can't work around the system, and then they see the kinds of things that we're talking about with the NDIA is being criticised for not going through the proper processes and being holding themselves to a high standard, and it just undermines your confidence in the system.
It does, and like I said, with all the media, and journalists and government coming and saying, "Oh, the NDIS is getting away from us, and it's costing $50 billion and shouldn't be that high." Well, 27 million to 135 to 210 million just for the software program. It's a lot. All that adds up. Like the $440,000 that was paid out to the consultancy firm that ran it through an AI, which was basically factually wrong, and they gave back 98,000, I believe. All these things add up. What are we not hearing about? How many of these things are we not hearing about? And how much are all these things adding up to? We could be looking at multi-billions of dollars worth of stuff-ups that is just solely the responsibility of the government.
Well, it's really hit and miss, because I know where I worked, they were really good. Everyone that I knew felt as though they were a public servant and literally serving the public. They were trying to do their best with every taxpayer cent that they had. They were very conscious about not wasting money. We didn't have big budgets, and we did way more with tiny budgets that larger agencies did with budgets that were 10 times the amount. It can be done, and I've certainly heard of occasions where there was funding that was ridiculously wasted, things that you just look at it and go, that's never going to succeed. How did this not pass? How did this pass the pub test? There's a term that's going around a lot. How did this pass the pub test? If someone just said, this is what we're doing to a bunch of mates at a pub, would the mates at the pub go, oh, that doesn't sound like that at work? Why don't we have that basic level of common sense in everything in the public service? You're not always going to get it right. When you are holding yourself to a higher standard, you'll find that there will be organisations that will try and take advantage of you. But I think that there are some people in the federal government that are doing a fantastic job, doing really, really well, working really hard and making things happen. But there are some times where people drop the ball and you just look at it and go, well, how did that happen? How did no one along that chain look at it and go, hey, this is not the way things should be?
Yeah, I mean, you could look at it from a taxpayer's point of view. Now, even if you don't work and you're living off the pension, you still pay taxes. You still pay GST.
Mm.
So your tax money, everybody has a right to know where the tax money's gone, regardless of what you do for a living and what your standing is in the community. We have a right to know where our tax money's going, how it's being spent, and how the government is dropping the ball. So we don't keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again. That's the biggest thing for me. That's where we need to hold the government and the NDIA senior management accountable.
Yes.
So I think we sort of covered everything we need to cover with Salesforce. So we might just end the stream now. If anybody wants some more information, just send me an email at blindadvocate007@gmail.com. If anybody out there wants the links to Adam Morris emailing lists, which is NDIS and OzDiscuss, send me an email at blindadvocate007@gmail.com, and I'll send you those links to Adam Morris email. It's a really great service that Adam started, and there's so much fantastic information that comes out of them. I believe, my opinion is it's worthwhile to join those sorts of emailing lists. A lot of great information comes along on a regular basis. But thank you for joining us today, Chris.
Yep.
Your input was great.
Thank you. And if anyone wants to look up any of those numbers that we were talking about, I think that we found most of those fairly easily through. A lot of them are on the government, Australian New South Wales, the Australian government website, and also on mainstream newspapers like the Australian, the Guardian, the Mercury, the Sydney Morning Herald. There's been quite a lot of news out there, but it just doesn't reach front page, so people are largely unaware of it.
Yeah, people just we get used to the bad stuff that goes on. We just shrug it off now. And makes news for a day or two, then nobody remembers it. But I think I'm going to keep going with this Salesforce tender and the cost blowout. And I will be putting in a freedom of information request into the NDIA. And if they don't give me the information that I'm asking for, I'll just go through the Privacy Commissioner and enforce them to do it. So there are options out there for people who want information. But thank you for joining us today. We might end that today. Okay, thanks everyone. I'll see you next time.
Medic! Medic! I've been hit with the truth! Man down! Man down! Quick, like and subscribe before it's too late!